Find somewhere comfortable, somewhere the weight of the day can finally stop pressing so hard. You don't need to follow any of this closely. You don't need to remember a single word. Just let the sounds arrive, the way a tide arrives quietly without asking anything of you. We are in no hurry tonight. If today was hard, I want you to know that's understood. If you're lying here with something still turning over in your mind, some unfinished worry, some half-formed fear, you don't have to solve it right now. You don't have to solve it at all tonight. Whatever you're carrying, you can set it down for a little while. Just here, just for now. Tonight we're going to spend some time with one of the quietest, most extraordinary things that happens on this planet. Every single autumn, every single spring, while most of us are asleep and completely unaware of it. High above our rooftops, above the orange glow of our streetlights, above the clouds sometimes, small birds are flying through the dark, crossing oceans, crossing continents, finding their way home across thousands of miles of empty sky, guided by forces so subtle and so ancient that we are only just beginning to understand them. It is one of those things that, when you sit with it long enough, becomes genuinely difficult to hold in your mind all at once. Not because it's complicated, though parts of it are, but because it is so quietly beautiful, so vast, so patient. So let the words come and go. Let your body grow heavy. We'll wander through this slowly, together, the way you might walk through a field at dusk, not going anywhere in particular, just moving gently through something that deserves to be noticed. Long before anyone understood how birds found their way, people simply watched them vanish. Every autumn, the swallows disappeared. The warblers were gone. For most of human history, this was a mystery so complete that people filled it with whatever explanations felt possible. Aristotle, one of the most careful thinkers of the ancient world, wrote in the 4th century before the Common Era that swallows must hibernate somewhere, tucked into crevices, sleeping through the cold. He was not a foolish man. He simply had no way of knowing what was actually happening. The disappearance of birds was so total, so absolute, that dormancy seemed more plausible than the truth. In 55, a Swedish priest named Olaus Magnus wrote with some confidence that swallows spent the winter at the bottom of lakes, pressed together in the mud, waiting for warmth to call them back up. Fishermen, he said, sometimes pulled them up in their nets, whole clusters of them cold and still. The image is tender in its wrongness. People wanted so badly to believe the birds were somewhere nearby, just hidden, just resting, not truly gone. And then there was the Reverend Charles Morton, an English minister writing in the 1680s, who proposed with apparent seriousness that birds migrated to the moon. To the moon. He calculated that the journey would take about 2 months, which he thought aligned rather neatly with the timing of their absence. It is easy to smile at this now. But there is something in it, something that speaks to how far outside ordinary experience the truth actually was. The moon felt more plausible than Africa. The truth, of course, is more remarkable than any of these. A tiny bird, weighing less than a handful of coins, flies from Canada to South America and back again. It does this in the dark. It does this alone, and it knows, with a precision that still astonishes researchers who have spent entire careers studying it, exactly where it is going. We began to understand this slowly over the course of the 20th century. It started with something simple, a small metal ring on a small leg. Bird banding, as it came to be called, allowed researchers for the first time to follow individual birds across years and continents. A warbler banded in one country would be found months later, thousands of miles away. The same bird. Confirmed. The journeys were real. And then the question became, how? That question is still being answered. And the answers, it turns out, involve quantum physics. They involve the stars. They involve smell. They involve a form of perception so far outside our own experience that we genuinely have no analogy for it. But we'll come to all of that slowly, gently, the way the night comes. Picture a young bird. It has never made this journey before. It hatched in a nest somewhere in the forests of North America, or perhaps the scrublands of Europe earlier in the year. It has never seen winter. It has never felt the particular pull that is beginning to stir in its body now as the days grow shorter and the light changes its angle. And yet, something in it knows. Not in the way that you know a fact, consciously, deliberately, more the way you know, even before you're fully awake, that something is different about the morning. A deep knowing, an ancient one. Around 80% of migratory birds make their journeys at night. This is not accidental. The air at night is calmer, cooler, more stable for flight. The great hawks and falcons that would prey on a small songbird during the day are resting, and the night sky, it turns out, is not darkness. It is a map. A Cornell University scientist named Stephen Emlen spent much of the 1970s trying to understand exactly how young birds learn to read that map. He worked with indigo buntings, small, vivid birds that breed in North America and winter in Central America. He placed young buntings in specially designed enclosures, planetarium-style chambers where he could control the sky they saw. And what he discovered was both simple and extraordinary. The birds did not memorize constellations. They were not looking for Orion or the Pleiades. What they were doing was watching the sky rotate, because that still point, that quiet center around which everything else revolves, is north. On our planet, the star that happens to sit almost exactly at that pivot point is Polaris. And young buntings, in their first summer of life, watch the night sky long enough and carefully enough to find it. Not by being told, not by instinct in any simple sense, by observation, by a kind of patient, unhurried attention to the turning of the world above them. Emlen showed that when he altered the apparent center of rotation in his planetarium, the birds adjusted. They oriented themselves toward whatever point the stars were rotating around, not toward any specific star. The compass they were building was not a star map, it was a map of motion, of rotation, of the way the sky breathes through the night. There is something quietly moving about this. A bird, not yet a season old, lying in a nest somewhere, looking up. Learning the sky the way a child learns the face of someone they love. Not analytically, not deliberately, just by being present to it, night after night, until the knowledge becomes part of them. Franz and Eleanor Sauer, a German husband and wife working in the 1960s, had already demonstrated that birds could navigate by stars even in a planetarium, without any other cues, without landmarks, without the sun. Their warblers would orient themselves toward their intended migratory direction simply by looking at the artificial sky above them. Change the sky, and the birds changed their direction. The stars were not decoration. They were instruction. And yet, And yet, which means there is something else. Wolfgang and Roswitha Wulchko were a German couple, scientists both, who spent decades asking one of the most quietly revolutionary questions in modern biology. Their work began in the 1960s and continued for half a century, and what they found changed everything we thought we knew about animal perception. They discovered that birds can feel the Earth's magnetic field, not in the way you feel warmth on your skin or the roughness of bark under your fingers. Something far more subtle than that. Something that does not have a name in any human language, because humans, as far as we know, do not experience it. But birds do, and they use it the way we might use a compass, or the way a sailor once used the stars. The Wulchkos worked with European robins, those small familiar birds with the red-orange breast that are found across much of Europe. They placed the robins in circular cages lined with paper so they could see where the birds were trying to go. When the Earth's magnetic field was normal and undisturbed, the robins consistently oriented themselves in the direction they would need to migrate. When the researchers altered the magnetic field using coils of wire around the cage, the birds altered their direction to match. They were reading the field, responding to it, using it. This was not a compass in the sense of north versus south. The Wulchkos found something more nuanced than that. Birds seem to use what is called an inclination compass. Near the equator, they run more nearly parallel to the surface. A bird reading this inclination can tell whether it is moving toward the equator or away from it, whether it is heading into the field lines or across them. It is a different kind of orientation than ours, more like reading the slope of an invisible hill than following an arrow on a dial. But the truly astonishing question was always, how? How does a bird feel a magnetic field? What organ, what tissue, what mechanism allows this? And the answer, when it began to emerge, came from a direction no one expected. It came from quantum physics. In the 1970s, a theoretical chemist named Klaus Scholten proposed something that seemed, at the time, almost impossibly strange. He suggested that the magnetic sensitivity of birds might arise not from some specialized magnetic organ, but from a chemical reaction, specifically from a class of reactions involving what are called radical pairs, pairs of molecules with unpaired electrons, whose quantum spin states are influenced by magnetic fields. For decades, this idea sat at the edge of mainstream science, interesting but unproven. And then researchers began to find the molecules that might make it real. They are called cryptochromes, light-sensitive proteins found in the eyes of birds, among other places. When blue light falls on a cryptochrome molecule, it triggers a chemical reaction that produces a radical pair, two molecules, each with an unpaired electron whose quantum states become entangled, and those entangled electrons, spinning in their quantum states, are exquisitely sensitive to the direction and inclination of magnetic fields. The magnetic field influences how quickly these radical pairs convert from one quantum state to another. It perceives the magnetic field not as a separate sense exactly, but perhaps as something woven into its vision, a kind of overlay on what it sees. Some researchers have described it as the bird seeing the magnetic field as a pattern of light and shadow, a subtle brightening or dimming in certain directions, a visual texture to an invisible force. In 2021, scientists at the University of Oldenburg, working with colleagues from Oxford, isolated a specific protein called cryptochrome 4 from the retinas of European robins. They measured its magnetic sensitivity directly. And what they found was exactly what quantum theory predicted. The electrons within the molecule shifted in response to magnetic fields in the precise way the radical pair mechanism had suggested. It was, One researcher said, the clearest evidence yet that quantum mechanics is not just a phenomenon of physics laboratories and subatomic particles. It is happening inside living creatures, inside the eye of a robin, hovering at the edge of a European garden. That is worth sitting with for a moment. A robin, small enough to hold in your cupped hands, navigates by a quantum phenomenon occurring in its retina. The same physics that describes the behavior of particles at the edge of what we can measure is happening in a bird's eye, right now, tonight, somewhere out in the dark. There is a third navigational sense that birds carry, one that is perhaps even harder to imagine than the magnetic compass, and that is their sense of smell. We tend to think of birds as creatures of sight. Their eyes are extraordinary, it is true. Many can see ultraviolet light. Some can perceive polarized light, the angle at which sunlight bounces off water and atmosphere. But smell is something we rarely associate with birds at all, and yet, for navigation, especially over open ocean, over the vast, featureless blue of the Pacific or the Atlantic, smell may be one of the most important tools they have. The idea first gained traction through experiments with homing pigeons. Researchers found that pigeons deprived of their sense of smell, either through surgery or by blocking their nostrils, were significantly impaired in their ability to find their way home. They still arrived, often, but their routes were more wandering, more uncertain. They made detours that their intact companions did not make. Something was missing. The hypothesis that emerged is this: birds build what researchers call an olfactory map. As young birds grow up in their home territory, they are surrounded by smells carried on the wind. The breeze from the south carries different organic compounds than the breeze from the north. The smell of the sea is different from the smell of forest. The particular mixture of volatile compounds in the atmosphere is not random. It is distributed in gradients, stable patterns that vary with geography and prevailing winds. A young bird, breathing all of this in during its first weeks and months of life, is not consciously cataloguing it, but something in its brain is building an association. This smell means this direction. That smell means that way. Over time, the bird acquires a kind of chemical atlas of the world around it, a map made not of lines and symbols, but of scent. When it migrates and when it returns, it can use this map. Not perfectly, not infallibly, but as another layer of information, another thread in the web of cues it uses to orient itself in space. There is something in this that feels, if you turn it over gently in your mind, rather like memory. Not the sharp verbal memory of facts and dates, but the deep, embodied memory of the body. The kind that is triggered by a smell. The way the scent of something from childhood can take you somewhere entirely specific, somewhere precise and warm in an instant. Birds may be doing something structurally similar, but across thousands of miles. The smell of home, carried on the wind, drawing them back. There is even evidence that pigeons smell more acutely through their right nostril than their left. That the right nostril plays a more dominant role in processing olfactory information for navigation. When researchers blocked the right nostril but left the left one open, the bird's routes became more convoluted, more uncertain. Block the left and leave the right open, and they navigated much as normal. The asymmetry is delicate and strange, a reminder that biology is not always symmetrical and that the mechanisms of perception are often more specific and more peculiar than we might expect. So a migrating bird, flying through the dark over an ocean it has never crossed before, is doing several things simultaneously. It is reading the stars when they are visible. It is feeling the angle and inclination of the Earth's magnetic field through quantum reactions in its retina. It is sampling the air for the chemical signatures of geography, and it is integrating all of this in real time into something like a sense of where it is and where it needs to go. We have GPS. We have satellites. We have instruments that cost tens of thousands of dollars and require enormous infrastructure to maintain. A warbler weighing 11 grams does all of this with proteins and starlight and the faint whisper of a magnetic field. It is one thing to understand the mechanisms of navigation in the abstract. It is another to try to hold in your mind the actual journeys these birds make. Consider the Arctic tern. It breeds in the high Arctic, in the brief, blazing summer of the far north, where the sun barely sets and the tundra is briefly green and alive. Then, as the season turns, it begins to move south, farther south than any other bird, all the way to the Antarctic, pole to pole, twice a year, every year, for a lifespan that can exceed 30 years. When researchers fitted Arctic terns with tiny tracking devices and followed their routes, what they found was not a straight line. The terns did not simply fly south. They followed great looping arcs across the Atlantic, tracing the paths of prevailing winds, riding the air currents that would carry them most efficiently. They knew, in whatever way birds know things, that the shortest path is not always the fastest, and that the wind is something to be used rather than fought. The total distance an Arctic tern covers in a year is staggering. More than 49,000 miles, 80,000 kilometers. Over a lifetime of 3 decades, a single tern will travel a distance equivalent to 3 round trips to the moon. 3 round trips to the moon. And back. They weigh about 100 grams. Less than a bar of chocolate. Then there is the bar-tailed godwit. A shorebird, sandy brown and unremarkable in appearance, that undertakes what may be the most physically extreme journey of any animal on Earth. In the autumn, bar-tailed godwits gather on the tidal flats of Alaska. They spend weeks eating, almost continuously, building up fat reserves until they are nearly double their lean weight. Their bodies undergo a transformation in preparation for what is coming. Their digestive organs, the stomach, the intestines, actually shrink. The liver and the kidneys reduce in size. The heart and the flight muscles grow. The bird is remodeling itself from the inside, shedding the organs it will not need and expanding the ones it will, making room for the fuel that will carry it across the largest ocean on Earth. And then it flies, non-stop. Across the Pacific Ocean, from Alaska to New Zealand or Tasmania, without landing, without eating, without drinking, for 11 days. Sometimes more. The longest non-stop flight of any animal ever recorded was made by a juvenile bar-tailed godwit in 2022. A young bird making this crossing for the very first time, flying approximately 8,400 miles in just over 11 days. 11 days, without stopping, without sleep, or at least without sleep as we understand it. How do they manage this? How does any bird sustain 11 days of continuous flight? Part of the answer lies in those extraordinary physiological preparations, but part of it lies in something that researchers only confirmed relatively recently. Something that changes the way we think about sleep itself. Birds can sleep while they are flying. Not fully. Not in the way you are drifting now or hope to drift soon, but in a partial, extraordinary way. One hemisphere of the brain enters a state of slow-wave sleep, the deep, restorative kind, while the other hemisphere remains awake. One eye closes, the other stays open. The sleeping half of the brain rests. The waking half maintains course, reads the air, keeps the wings moving. This is called unihemispheric slow-wave sleep. It has been documented in dolphins and other marine mammals who face a similar problem. They need to breathe consciously. They cannot simply fall into the deep unconsciousness that land mammals enjoy. And it has been documented in birds, particularly in species that spend long periods aloft. Frigate birds, those large, angular seabirds with the deeply forked tails that soar over tropical oceans, were fitted with tiny EEG monitors in one study, devices that could measure the electrical activity of their brains while they flew. The results were clear. While gliding on rising columns of warm air, the birds entered slow-wave sleep in one hemisphere at a time. Sometimes, briefly, both hemispheres slept simultaneously, though this was rare and lasted only seconds. On average, the frigate birds sleeping in flight managed about 45 minutes of total sleep per day while airborne. On land, frigate birds sleep for 12 hours. The difference between 12 hours and 45 minutes is vast, and yet they functioned, they navigated, they hunted, they returned. This is not offered as a lesson about sleep deprivation. Please don't hear it that way. Birds have physiological adaptations that allow them to manage on fragmented, partial sleep during migration in ways that humans simply do not. For you, tonight, rest is what matters. Real rest. The kind that asks nothing of you. But there is something quietly wonderful in the image. A bird flying through the dark over the Pacific, 10,000 feet above the waves, half of its brain asleep, half awake, dreaming and navigating at the same time. Moving through the world and through sleep simultaneously, as if the two were not as separate as we had thought. The indigo bunting, the small bird that Stephen Emman studied in his planetarium at Cornell, weighs about 14 grams. It travels from its breeding grounds in North America to its wintering grounds in Central America and back again each year, a round trip of several thousand miles. It makes this journey alone. They do not follow a guide. They emerge from the nest, spend a summer watching the sky turn, and then, when the season calls them, they go. By themselves. Individual banded warblers have been found returning not just to the same country, not just to the same forest, but to the same tree. The same specific tree in the same forest in Canada after spending the winter in South America. We are talking about an animal with a brain the size of a pea, navigating by quantum chemistry and starlight to a single tree on a continent it left 8 months ago. It has been described by researchers who study it as centimeter precision. Centimeter precision. Across thousands of miles. There is a sadness woven into this story, and it would be wrong to pass through the night without acknowledging it gently. All of these extraordinary navigational abilities, the quantum compasses, the star maps, the scent atlases built up over a lifetime of careful attention, all of them evolved over millions of years in a world that was, at night, dark. The night sky that birds learned to read was a dark sky. Stars were bright against it. The faint rotation of the celestial dome was visible from horizon to horizon. And the landscape below, the rivers, the coastlines, the mountains that also serve as landmarks for migrants, was not lit from below by the orange glow of 10,000 cities. We have changed that. In the span of a few generations, we have filled the night with light. A study published in the journal Nature Communications in 2023, funded by NASA and the National Science Foundation, used weather radar data to map where migrating birds were landing across the United States. They found that artificial light at night was one of the strongest predictors of where birds would stop, not because those places were better habitat, but because the birds were drawn to the light, disoriented by it, pulled toward it the way a moth is pulled toward a flame. Birds that migrate at night, many of them, make soft contact calls as they fly. These calls help them stay oriented, help them communicate with other birds moving through the same dark sky. But when they become disoriented by city lights, they call more, and those calls attract other birds, drawing them toward the same dangerous brightness, toward the glass towers and the illuminated facades that kill hundreds of millions of birds in North America alone each year. It is a quiet tragedy, unfolding in the dark while most of us sleep. And yet the response to it is also, in its way, quiet and hopeful. More than 20 cities across North America have implemented what are called lights-out programs. During the peak migration seasons, buildings turn off their unnecessary lights. The upper floors of skyscrapers go dark. Facade lighting is dimmed or extinguished, and the birds, given back even a partial darkness, find their way more truly. It costs almost nothing to participate. A switch turned off, a timer adjusted, and somewhere above the city, a warbler that was spiraling in confusion finds north again and continues on. There is also the question of what is happening to migration itself as the climate shifts. A study published in 2025 followed Hudsonian godwits, large shorebirds that make one of the longest migrations of any North American bird. Researchers at the University of Massachusetts Amherst found that this population was now arriving nearly a week later to their Alaskan breeding grounds than they had a decade ago. A week later. And yet, the Alaskan springs were arriving earlier, the snow melting sooner, the brief window of peak food availability opening and closing before the birds could reach it. The birds were falling out of step with the seasons they had evolved to match. This is called migration mistiming. And it matters because timing is everything in a short Arctic summer. Arrive too late, and the insects that fuel the growth of your chicks have already peaked and declined. Arrive too late, and the season is over before it has properly begun. The birds are not failing. They are doing what they have always done, following the ancient cues of day length and temperature that have guided their ancestors for millions of years. But the world those cues describe has changed faster than the birds can adapt. These are not reasons for despair tonight. They are reasons for a kind of quiet, attentive care. The kind that begins with noticing, with paying attention to the world that holds us all. It is late now, and we are moving toward the end of things, the way a conversation between friends moves toward its natural close, not cut off, just gently arriving somewhere quieter. The science of bird navigation is still unfolding. The researchers at the University of Oldenburg, working with cryptochrome 4 and the quantum mechanics of avian vision, will continue their work. The question of exactly how magnetic information is translated into a signal the brain can read, how the chemistry of a radical pair becomes the felt sense of direction, remains open. It is one of those beautiful open questions, the kind that remind us how much of the world is still waiting to be understood. There is something in that which feels, tonight, like a kind of comfort. The idea that the world is not yet fully explained, that there are still mysteries as old as the first bird that flew south and found its way back again, that beneath the surface of the ordinary, beneath the night sky you might glance at through a window before you sleep, extraordinary things are happening that we are only beginning to name. Somewhere tonight, a small bird is flying. It left its breeding ground weeks ago when something in its body told it the time had come. It has been flying through the dark, reading the stars when they are visible, feeling the inclination of the Earth's magnetic field as a kind of visual texture overlaid on everything it sees, tasting the air for the chemical signatures that tell it where it is. Half of its brain may be resting right now in slow, unhurried waves of sleep, while the other half holds its course. It does not know in any conscious sense how far it has come. It does not know how far remains. It knows only the direction, the deep, ancient, embodied sense of where it needs to go, and the patient willingness to keep moving through the dark until it gets there. There is something in that which feels worth carrying into sleep, not as a lesson, not as instruction, just as a quiet companion image. You don't need to navigate anything tonight. You don't need to find anything or fix anything or figure anything out. The night asks nothing of you. The dark outside your window is full of things moving quietly, doing what they need to do, without urgency, without effort that you can see. The bar-tailed godwit shrank its own organs to make the journey possible. You don't have to do anything like that. You just have to let the weight of you sink a little further into whatever is holding you right now. Let the day, which is already receding, recede a little more. A warbler, weighing less than 2 tablespoons of water, flew from South America to a specific tree in Canada. It found the tree. It rested. And then, in its own time, it will make the journey again. The Arctic tern has seen more summers than most creatures alive. Pole to pole, year after year, following the light, living in an almost perpetual summer of its own making. It does not rush. It follows the wind. It takes the long way when the long way is the right way. There are stars above you right now, even if clouds are hiding them. The same stars that a young indigo bunting watched from its nest, learning north by watching the sky turn. They are still turning. They are always turning. Patient and unhurried, the way they have been for longer than there have been birds to read them. The magnetic field of the earth passes through you right now, through the walls of this room, through your body, gentle and constant and utterly imperceptible to you. Birds feel it as something like light. You feel nothing, or perhaps something you have no name for. But it is there. The planet, breathing its invisible breath around everything that lives on it. The night is deep, and the world is full of quiet motion. Small birds crossing dark water. The slow wheel of stars. The faint lines of force threading through the air. And somewhere in a research laboratory, someone is looking at a molecule, a cryptochrome protein isolated from the eye of a European robin, and watching electrons move in response to a magnetic field, and understanding something about the nature of the world that no one understood before, quantum physics and bird migration, and the mystery of how living things find their way home. All arriving at the same place, in the same moment, in the same patient act of looking closely at what is actually there. You don't need to hold any of this. It will be here tomorrow. The birds will still be flying. The stars will still be turning. The questions will still be open, waiting. And so we leave it there. The night is already doing its slow, soft work. Somewhere behind you, the day has grown distant. Let it stay there. The birds are flying. The stars are turning. And you, at last, can simply rest. Sleep well. There is a detail about the sower's work that tends to stay with people when they hear it. The birds they studied were hand-raised. They had never seen the night sky from outside a laboratory. They had never made a migration, And yet, when placed under the artificial stars of the planetarium, they oriented themselves in precisely the direction their species would need to travel. The knowledge was not learned from experience. It was there before experience. Carried in the body like a letter written before the bird was born, sealed and waiting. This is one of those facts that is easy to state and difficult to fully absorb. We tend to think of knowledge as something acquired, something built up through living, and much of it is. But somewhere in the architecture of a warbler's nervous system, the direction of an entire continent away was already encoded, not as a thought, not as a memory, as a quiet, insistent orientation, the way a compass needle is oriented before you ever pick it up. Researchers call this vector navigation, a direction and a duration held in the body. Fly this way for this long. The young bird has no destination it can picture. It has never seen the wintering grounds it is heading for. It has only the pull, the ancient, patient pull of a direction that was written into it before it ever opened its eyes. Stephen Emlen's later work found something even more nuanced. When he raised young buntings under a planetarium sky that had no rotation at all, a sky where the stars were fixed and still, the birds failed to develop a proper star compass. They could not orient correctly. The rotation was not a bonus feature of the sky. It was the lesson. Without the movement, the map could not be built. The sky had to turn for the bird to find north within it. There is something in this that feels almost like a teaching. That understanding sometimes requires motion, that the still image does not always contain what the moving one does. A bird needs to watch the sky change to understand where the center is. We sometimes need to move through something, to live through it, to find what is steady at the heart of it. The question of how magnetic information reaches the brain has led researchers down some unexpected corridors. One of those corridors involves iron, specifically tiny crystals of magnetite, a form of iron oxide that have been found in the tissues of various animals, including birds. Magnetite was first identified in the heads of homing pigeons in the early 1980s. Researchers found clusters of these iron crystals near the beak, in the tissue that lines the upper portion of the nasal cavity. The crystals were arranged in chains, and they were magnetic. When the surrounding magnetic field changed, the crystals would respond, bending or shifting slightly in a way that could theoretically stimulate nearby nerve cells. For a while, this seemed like the answer. Here was a physical compass, a biological lodestone sitting in the bird's head. The magnetite hypothesis was elegant. It was mechanically intuitive. It was the kind of answer that made sense. But over time, doubts accumulated. The magnetite deposits in birds turned out to be inconsistent in their location and their structure. Some researchers found them in the beak, others in the inner ear, others in the eye. The amounts varied between individuals in ways that didn't quite fit the idea of a precision instrument, and when the cryptochrome findings began to emerge, the magnetic compass in the eye began to seem more compelling than the compass in the beak. It is possible that both systems exist, that birds have more than one way of reading the magnetic field, just as they have more than one way of reading the sky. There is also evidence that the magnetic compass and the star compass interact, that they are not simply parallel systems running independently, but that birds calibrate one against the other. Young birds, as they learn the sky, may be using the star compass to set and verify their magnetic compass, and during migration, if the stars are obscured, the magnetic compass takes over, already calibrated, already tuned to the star-derived sense of north that the bird built in its first summer. The robustness of this is worth noting. These birds are not navigating with a single fragile instrument. They are navigating with a suite of overlapping, mutually reinforcing systems, any one of which can carry the load if the others are compromised. The clouds close in, and the magnetic sense continues. The magnetic field is locally distorted by a geological anomaly, and the stars, when they emerge, provide a correction. The scent of the air confirms or questions the other signals. Everything checks against everything else. A team of researchers in Sweden, working at Lund University, found that when they exposed migrating birds to the kind of low-frequency electromagnetic noise that is now ubiquitous in urban environments, radio waves, the emissions from power lines and electronic equipment, the birds' magnetic compasses were disrupted. But when the researchers shielded the birds from this electromagnetic noise, even in the same city, the compass worked again. The field was there. The birds could read it. They just needed the noise to stop. This finding, published in the journal Nature in 2014, caused some quiet concern among researchers because that kind of electromagnetic noise is not going away. It is, if anything, increasing. Every new wireless device, every new transmission tower adds to the background hum of human electromagnetic activity that now blankets most of the inhabited world. The birds are not defeated by this. They are adaptable within limits. But those limits are real and worth knowing about. The olfactory map hypothesis has been tested and challenged and refined over the decades since it was first proposed. One of the more elegant tests was conducted by a researcher named Anna Gagliardo, working with colleagues in Italy and Germany. Gagliardo and her team took homing pigeons and displaced them to locations they had never visited before. Some birds were allowed to smell the air during transport. Others were prevented from doing so, carried in sealed containers that blocked all olfactory information during the journey. When released, the birds that had smelled the air during transport oriented themselves more accurately, more quickly, toward home. The birds that had been deprived of olfactory information during the journey were more confused, their initial orientation more scattered, their departure directions less precise. The smell of the journey itself was informative. Not just the smell of home, but the changing scents encountered along the way, the gradient of information that told the bird something about where it now was relative to where it had been. There is a parallel here, a soft one, to the way humans navigate through memory. We often know where we are in a story, in a relationship, in a life, not by looking at a fixed point, but by feeling the direction of change, where things have been moving, what has been shifting. Gagliardo's work also showed that the importance of smell varied between individuals and between species. Some birds were more dependent on olfactory information than others. Some seemed to compensate for its absence more readily. Navigation, it turns out, is not a single unified system, but something more like a conversation between multiple sources of information, and different birds conduct that conversation differently. Shearwaters, large seabirds that spend most of their lives far out over the open ocean, have particularly well-developed olfactory systems. They can smell prey, fish oils, and the compounds released by phytoplankton under stress from distances of kilometers. And they use smell to navigate in ways that are still being mapped. A shearwater released far from its home colony, its nostrils blocked, will wander. The sane bird with its sense of smell intact will often orient homeward almost immediately, even from a location it has never visited before. The ocean, which looks featureless from above, is not featureless to a nose. It has regions of different chemistry, different temperatures, different biological activity, each producing its own particular signature of volatile compounds. The shearwater reads this as a map, the vast blue wildernesses, to a bird with the right senses, a landscape as legible as a countryside of hills and rivers. The story of the bar-tailed godwit's journey is not just a story of distance. It is a story of timing, of the extraordinary precision with which these birds read the season and the wind. Godwits do not leave Alaska at a fixed date each year. They wait. They watch the weather. They are waiting, researchers believe, for a specific kind of weather system, a low-pressure system moving across the North Pacific that will generate sustained tailwinds from the north and northwest. These tailwinds will carry them south and west toward New Zealand, adding hundreds of miles of free distance to their journey, reducing the energetic cost of the crossing. Satellite tracking data has shown that the birds that wait for these tailwinds arrive in better condition than those that depart early, before the favorable winds develop. The waiting is not passivity. It is calculation, a kind of patient embodied meteorology, reading the air pressure and the wind direction and the temperature in ways we cannot fully replicate even with instruments. When the conditions are right, multiple godwits will often depart within hours of each other, even from different parts of the Alaskan coast, as if they have received the same signal simultaneously. They have. The weather system is the signal. The sky is the announcement. And the birds read it. There is also something remarkable about how they land. After 11 days over open ocean, after burning through every gram of stored fat, after running their bodies to the absolute edge of what is physiologically possible, they arrive at the tidal flats of New Zealand or Tasmania and they eat. Almost immediately, small invertebrates in the mud, tiny crabs and worms. And within a few weeks they have recovered. The organs that shrank before departure have regrown. The weight has returned. The body has rebuilt itself. And then, in a few months, they will do it again. The bird knows this. In whatever way birds know things, it does not take the same path home that it took away. Then there is the story of black-capped warblers, small birds whose story has become something of a classic in the study of how migration evolves. Blackcaps traditionally wintered in sub-Saharan Africa, spending the cold months south of the Sahara before returning to breed in Europe. But in the second half of the 20th century, something changed. A small population of blackcaps began wintering in Britain and Ireland instead, attracted by the mild winters and the garden bird feeders that had become common in British gardens. These birds were not making a shorter version of the same journey. They were making a different journey, to a different destination, guided by a different genetic program. And when researchers studied them, they found that the birds wintering in Britain had a subtly different wing shape than their African wintering relatives, rounder wings, better suited to the shorter journey and the denser woodland habitat of Britain. The population had been genetically diverging, selecting for traits suited to the new route in just a few decades. Migration routes, it turns out, are not fixed forever. They evolve. Populations can shift, can find new wintering grounds, can develop new routes in response to changing conditions, given enough time and enough variation to select from. The birds are not locked into the past. They are, in their slow, generational way, responding to the present. There is a researcher named Bridget Stutchbury, a Canadian ornithologist at York University in Toronto, who spent years wondering what birds actually did during migration. She knew they migrated. Everyone knew that. But the details, the daily schedule of it, how far they flew each night, how long they rested, how they distributed their effort across the weeks of the journey, were largely unknown. The birds were too small for the satellite tags that had revealed the Godwit's Pacific crossing. They disappeared into the dark and came back in the spring. And that was all anyone could say. Then, miniaturized light-sensitive geolocators became available. Devices small enough to be carried by a songbird that recorded light levels throughout the day and night, allowing researchers to calculate position from the timing of sunrise and sunset. Stutchbury fitted these devices to wood thrushes and purple martins and waited. When the birds returned the following spring and she recolored the devices, what she found surprised her. The birds were not making slow, leisurely journeys. They were moving fast, much faster than anyone had assumed. Wood thrushes in spring migration were covering up to 500 kilometers in a single night, and they were spending far less time resting than the models had predicted. They pushed hard. They moved urgently in spring in a way they did not in autumn. The pressure to arrive early, to claim territory, to begin breeding was driving them to move at the edge of what their bodies could sustain. Autumn migration, by contrast, was more relaxed. The birds drifted south over weeks, stopping longer, resting more. The urgency of spring was absent. The season was generous, and the birds took their time. There is a kind of poetry in this. The same bird, the same journey in reverse, conducted in two entirely different registers, one fast and driven, one slow and unhurried, one shaped by the pressure of arrival, one by the luxury of no particular deadline. You are in the autumn register tonight. No urgency, no deadline. The night is long and there is nowhere you need to be. There is one more creature worth mentioning before the words grow quieter. The sooty shearwater. A bird that breeds on islands near New Zealand and then, after the breeding season, embarks on a figure-eight migration across the entire Pacific Ocean. Up the Western Pacific, across the North Pacific, down the Eastern Pacific, back across the South Pacific to home. A circuit of the largest ocean on the planet, completed in a single year every year. When researchers tracked sooty shearwaters with satellite tags, they found that individual birds were covering up to 900 kilometers per day. The total annual journey was in the range of 64,000 kilometers. 64,000. In a year. By a bird. And they do this largely alone, or in loose, shifting associations with other shearwaters, without any fixed group, without a leader, without anything we would recognize as a plan. Each bird carries its own map, its own compass, its own sense of where it is and where it needs to be. The Pacific, which covers more than a third of the Earth's surface, is their territory. They know it. The way you might know a room you have lived in for years, in the dark, by feel. The night is very deep now, and the words are growing softer. All of these birds, the shearwaters and the godwits and the buntings and the terns, are somewhere out there in it. Moving through the same darkness that is settling around you, guided by the same stars that are turning, slowly and without urgency, above the clouds above your roof.